Hachishaku-sama means 8 feet equals 2.5 m. My grandparents live in Japan. Every summer, my parents take me there to visit my grandparents. They live in a small village and have a large backyard. I like to play there in the summer. When I arrived, my grandparents always welcomed me warmly. I'm their only grandchild, so they always pamper me. The last time I saw them was the summer when I was 8 years old. As usual, my parents booked a flight to Japan and we drove from the airport to my grandparents' house. They were so happy to see me and had tons of little gifts to give me. My parents wanted to have some time alone, so after a few days, they went on a trip to another part of Japan, leaving me in the care of my grandparents. One day, I was playing in the yard, my grandparents were in the house. It was a hot summer day and I lay down on the grass to rest. I looked at the clouds and enjoyed the feeling of the soft rays of the sun and the gentle breeze. When I was about to stand up, I heard a strange noise.
Po, 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 po.
I don't know what it is and it's hard to find out where it comes from. It was like someone was mumbling to themselves and they just said
Po, po, po.
continuously in a deep male voice. I looked around, trying to find where the noise was coming from and then saw something on top of the fence at the end of the yard. It is a straw hat. It's not on the fence, it's behind the fence. That's where the sound comes from.
Po, po, po.
Po, then the hat started moving, as if someone was wearing it. The hat stopped at an opening in the fence and I saw a face. It was a woman. But the fence is very high, up to 8 feet, about 2.5 meters. I was surprised to see such a tall woman. I thought she was wearing stilts or some kind of giant high heels. Then she walked on and disappeared with a strange noise. Confused, I went into the house. My grandparents are drinking tea in the kitchen. I sat down and told them what happened. They didn't really pay attention to me, until I mentioned that strange noise again. Po,
po, po, po.
As soon as I mentioned it, they immediately froze. I don't know how to translate this part. My grandmother rolled her eyes and covered her mouth with her hand. My grandfather's face became very serious and then he grabbed my arm. This is very important, he said in an impatient voice. I don't know how to translate it properly. You have to say exactly. How tall is she? Across the fence in the yard, I replied, starting to feel scared. My grandfather asked me a lot of questions. Where is she? From when? What does she do? Has she seen you yet? I tried to answer all the questions. He suddenly ran into the hallway and made a phone call. I couldn't hear what he said. I looked at my grandmother and realized she was shaking. My grandfather returned to the room and told my grandmother, I have to go out for a moment, you stay here with the boy, don't take your eyes off him for a second. What's going on, sir? I cry. He looked at me sadly. You're liked by Hachishaku-sama. With that, he quickly went out, got in the car and drove away. I turned to her and asked, who is Hachishaku-sama? Don't worry, she answered me with a trembling voice. I will do something, you don't need to worry. While sitting nervously in the kitchen, she explained to me. She said that before there was a dangerous thing haunting this area. They called it Hachishaku-sama because of its height. In Japanese, Hachishaku-sama means 8 feet high, about 2.5 m. It appears in the form of a very tall woman and makes the sound
Po, po, po.
in a deep, male-like voice. It appears slightly different, depending on who sees it. Some say it looks like a pale old woman in a kimono, others say it is a girl in a white shroud. The only difference is the height and the sound it produces. A long time ago, it was captured by the monks and they intended to imprison it in a pile of ruins outside the village. They use 4 small statues of gods called Jizos placed in the 4 directions east, west, south, and north of that place to prevent it, Hachishaku-sama, from leaving there. It escaped somehow. It last appeared 15 years ago. My grandmother told me that anyone who saw Hachi, from now on, that's how I call it short, was destined to die within a few days. It's all so crazy that I don't know what to believe. When he returned home, there was a woman with him. She introduced herself as Kei-san and gave me a small, crumpled piece of paper and said take it and keep it. Then, she and he went upstairs to do something. I stayed with my grandmother in the kitchen again. I need to go to the toilet. My grandmother followed me into the bathroom and wouldn't let me close the door. I feel really frightened by all of this. After a while, he and Kei-san took me upstairs and took me to the bedroom. The window was covered in newspaper with ancient characters written on it. There are 4 small bowls containing salt in the 4 corners of the room and a small Buddha statue placed in the middle of the room on a small wooden box. And there's also a light blue bucket. What is the bucket for? I asked. Let me go to the bathroom there, he replied. Kei-san sat me down on the bed and said, soon, the sun will set, so listen carefully. You have to stay in this room until tomorrow morning. You are not allowed to go out under any circumstances until 7:00 a.m. tomorrow morning. Your grandparents will not call or talk to you until then. Remember, do not leave the room for any reason. I'll let your parents know what's going on. She spoke in a serious voice, making me just nod. You must follow all of Kei-san's instructions, he told me, and never let go of the piece of paper she gave you. And if anything happens, pray to Buddha. And remember to lock the door when we go out. They went out into the hallway and after saying hello, I closed the bedroom door and locked it. I turned on the TV and tried to watch, but I was so nervous, I felt sick with worry. She gave me snacks and rice balls, but I couldn't eat them. I felt imprisoned, depressed and afraid. I lay down on the bed and waited. I fell asleep without knowing it. When I woke up, it was already past 1 a.m. Suddenly, I realized that something was tapping on the window. I saw blood flowing from my face and my heart stopped for a beat. I desperately tried to calm down, telling myself that it was just the wind playing around or just some tree branches. I turned up the TV volume to drown out the tapping sound. Finally, it ended. That's when I heard my grandfather calling me. Are you okay? He asked. If you're alone there and feel scared, I can come and keep you company. I smiled and ran over to open the door, but then, my steps stopped. I had goosebumps all over my body. The voice is similar to his, but somehow it feels different. I don't know what it is, but I just know. What are you doing? He asked. You can open the door now. I glanced to my left and my spine felt cold. The salt in the bowl is gradually turning black. I backed away from the door. My whole body trembled with fear. I knelt down in front of the Buddha statue and held the parchment tightly. I desperately begged for help. Please save me from Hachishaku-sama, I groaned. Then, I heard a voice from outside the door.
Po, 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 po.
The door knocked again. I overcame my fear and bowed my head before the statue, half crying, half praying for the rest of the night. The salt in all 4 cups has turned black. I looked at the clock. It's 7:30 a.m. I carefully opened the door. Grandma and Kei-san were standing outside waiting for me. When she saw my face, she burst into tears. I'm glad you're still alive, she said. I went downstairs and was surprised to see my parents sitting in the kitchen. My grandfather came and said, hurry. We have to go. We walked out the front door and there was a big black van waiting to roll out. A few people in the village stood around, pointed at me and whispered, that boy. That van had 9 seats, they placed me right in the middle, 8. Men gathered around me. Mrs. Kei-san sat in the driver's seat. The person on my left looked at me and said, you're in trouble. I know you must be worried. Just keep your mind calm and close your eyes. We can't see, but you can. Don't open your eyes until we're safely out of here. My grandfather drove in front, my father's car followed behind. When everything was ready, our small convoy started rolling. We walked quite slowly. About 20 km/h, sometimes slower. A moment later, Kei-san said this is where we get stuck, and began silently pleading under his breath. That's when I heard that voice.
Po. 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 Po.
I grabbed the piece of parchment that Mrs. Kei-san put in my hand. I bowed my head, but I looked outside. I saw a white dress fluttering in the wind. It followed the van. That's Hachishaku-sama. It was outside the window, but still caught up with us. Then suddenly it bent down, looking at the truck. Not. I gasped. The man next to me shouted, "Close your eyes." I immediately closed my eyes as tightly as possible and squeezed the parchment tightly. Then the tapping noise started. The voice got louder and louder.
Po. 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 Po.
The sound of tapping on the windows was all around us. All people traveling in the car were startled and tense, feeling confused. They couldn't see 8 feet tall and couldn't hear his voice, but they could hear tapping on the window. Mrs. Kei-san began to plead, her voice getting louder and louder until it was like screaming. The atmosphere in the van was so tense that it was unbearable. A moment later, the knocking stopped and the voice disappeared. Kei-san looked back at us and said, "I think we're safe now." Everyone around me breathed a sigh of relief. The van pulled over to the side of the road and the men got out. They put me in my dad's car. My mother hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. He and my father bowed to the men walking on the street. Mrs. Kei-san walked to the window and asked me to hold up the piece of parchment she gave me. When I opened my eyes, I saw that it was all black. "I think you're okay now," she said. "But just to be sure, hold this for a while." She handed me a new piece of parchment. Then we went straight to the airport and Grandpa found us safely on the plane. When we took off, my parents breathed a sigh of relief. My dad said he had heard about 8 feet tall before. Many years ago, he liked his father's friend. He disappeared and was never seen again. My dad told me he liked other people and lived to tell about it. All of them had to leave Japan and settle abroad. They can never return to their homeland. It always chooses children as victims. They say that because children depend on their parents and family members. This makes them easier to fool when it appears like their parents. Dad said the men in the car were my blood relatives, and that's why they sat around me and why my dad and Grandpa sat in the front and back. It was all to trick Hachishaku-sama. It took some time to contact everyone and get them together, so I had to stay in my room all night. Dad also said that the Jizo figurines, the ones meant to get him stuck, were broken and that's how he escaped. I got goosebumps. I'm happy to finally be home. Those things happened more than 10 years ago. I have not seen my grandparents again since then. I feel like I can't stand in this country. A few weeks later, I called and talked to my grandparents on the phone again. Over the years, I tried to convince myself that it was just a legend, that everything that had happened was just an elaborate joke. But sometimes, I'm not sure. 2 years ago, my grandfather passed away. When he was sick, he did not let me visit him and left strict instructions, in his opinion, that I could not attend his funeral. So sad. A few days ago my grandmother called. She said she was diagnosed with cancer. She missed me terribly and wanted to see me one last time before she passed away. "Are you sure?" I asked, "Is it safe?" "It's been 10 years, she said. "It was a long time ago. Everything has been forgotten. You're grown up. I'm sure there won't be any problems. But, What about Hachishaku-sama? I ask. A moment later, the other end of the phone was silent. Then I heard a deep male voice say,
Po. Po. Po.